Okay.
All right. Sounds good. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to do this, Sardek. It is always a pleasure. You know that whether it's doing it virtually like this, or if we get a chance at one of the various expos that we both go to, whether ATD or training conference, always a pleasure to talk with the host of Ask a Master Facilitator, the master facilitator himself, author of Presentation Essentials. Great book. And I've got, of course, on back there, Speak for a Living. I almost said Speak Like a Trainer for some reason, but it's Speak for a Living. Sardek Love, welcome back. I appreciate you.
Dwayne, it's always a pleasure, my friend. And I'm a big fan of yours and this podcast. I think it's one of the most impactful podcasts in the whole global talent development industry. You're getting leaders that provide insights that are amazing. It's a joy to be back with you here.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I was looking through. I've got the training conference and expo guide right here for coming up in February, and I couldn't help but notice you're back again for the 3-day certification of not Ask a Master Facilitator, but the Master Facilitator Certificate. I cannot convince my company to send me back again, unfortunately, but I will encourage as many people as possible to go take that. I think the world of the way you deliver and the things that you teach in that. So that is one that I love, but I'm really interested in the standalone presentation that you're giving, the science of designing ridiculously engaging learning experiences. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so that's kind of where I pivoted here for the last several years into looking at neuroscience and to some degree, some psychology behind the things that we do. And what's interesting about the science of engagement, which is my primary focus, is that a lot of what we do has its roots in neuroscience and psychology, but most trainers, if not all trainers, are unaware of it. And I think you and I both are very big fans and somewhat disciples of Bob Pike. I don't know if Bob, because I never had that conversation with him, but I don't know if he just intuitively knew this stuff or he had done some research or maybe gotten some education on it. But a lot of the techniques that he taught all of us and you and I use, those things there are deep data around all of that, why it works from a neuroscience perspective. So I really pivoted into that. And now I'm going to, create awareness and expose all of these different little techniques for influencing others, getting people to buy in, getting them to take action, and things like that. So that's what that session is all about there at Training Magazine. I've been doing it for a while. It's named as the Science of Engagement. So they changed the title just a little bit here. Same program.
It sounds, I don't know if you're thinking this way, but that sounds like an amazing book also. I would love to sit down and read that sometime. But tell me, what are some of the things that you're talking about here specifically that we maybe have been using for a while, but now that we are able to look at the neuroscience at it, we better understand why it works?
And to your point around the book, spot on, my brother. Absolutely. That's part of why I've been doing it as a keynote for a while and collecting data along the way, because as you can imagine, a book publisher wants to see how are you going to sell a program. And one of the best ways to do that is to have a program already proven, proof of concept. Mm-hmm. So having said that, so for example, as you might remember in the Master Facilitator program, I have the engagement loop. And I actually created that based off of the neuroscience. And the 3 phases of that framework are grab people's attention, then create connection or allow the participants to create connection with each other. And then the 3rd phase of that is then create interaction. So for all intents and purposes, we grab their attention by doing something novel, and then we create an opportunity for them to connect. And I'll dive into this a little bit more here because this is where it gets really interesting. That connection piece where you allow participants to connect with each other and build trust. There's some neuroscience that explains why we should do that first, with having them do that with themselves first before we do it as a large group discussion. And then the interaction piece is what you and I know and what we would call as experiential learning. So the training activities and all that. So let's go back to a couple of things in terms of what we're already doing, but we may not know why we should do it. And also what in the research that I found, it became very clear that most training programs in their design are set up and they do this in a sequencing that is incorrect. So I'm going to
Okay.
be challenging instructional design in terms of the way they do things. So let me give you the very basic, simple way of it. With that connection piece, there is some strong neuroscience around this. So let me ask you a question. So when people deliver training, and you've seen people deliver training, and they ask a question, what is likely going to be the response that people get when they deliver training and they ask people a question?
Well, I would imagine they just got a message on their phone and they need to look at that. They definitely don't want to make eye contact with anyone in the room. It's not me.
Exactly. So they're going to get silence as a result of it, right? Most trainers will get bone crushing, mind numbing silence to their questions, and they don't understand it. And then they get frustrated. Well, the problem is actually rooted in some basic neuroscience. Just imagine if people are coming in, and most people are coming in now very cautious and very quiet. And there's a very specific reason for that: judgment, a fear of being judged. And let's keep it real. In the environment that we've come into coming out of the pandemic, there's a lot of, you had the cancel culture and all that. So people are very fearful of being judged. And we see that at an individual behavioral level. And when people come into our training, they are not really, especially if they don't know others around them, they're strangers. They don't know what their intentions are. So they're going to be silent. So what you've got to do initially is avoid doing questions in large group discussions.
Mhm.
A lot of training design is around that. If we overuse lecture, we may ask a lot of large group discussion type questions. You're going to get silence. So what do you do to overcome that? You've got to do something very quickly, and that is give them a chance to connect with each other and build trust there. And so I actually did a video for the Ask a Master Facilitator series, and this is the neuroscience technique is called escalating mutual disclosure. Now, all that is, quite frankly, is asking them questions and then having them respond to those questions at the table group level first. Put them in pair shares, put them in triads, put them in quads, but you spend your first hour of your course or so repeatedly asking questions and having them answer at the table group level first. Do not do much large group, because that allows them to create some connection. And then I'll say one more thing and then throw it back to you for questions on this. And by giving them a chance to answer questions, and so escalating mutual disclosure is ask a question that allows them to demonstrate a small amount of vulnerability. So low trust type questions where they can, maybe I say to the group, and let's say if you're part of the group, Dwayne, I would say, okay, how many of you have ever had a situation where you got silence to a question? Everybody would say yes. You would say yes. Okay, how many of you who have answered that question yes have had a technique that you use to overcome that? Now I'm asking you to be a little bit more vulnerable, and those who say yes, then I would say, okay, now share with your table group that one tip that you had for overcoming a response of silence. So 3 questions, gradually increasing the amount of vulnerability, and then leading to an edification of the person, letting them give their tips at the table group level. If you do that multiple times, they're going to get some trust built. And last thing I'll say on this, when they do it that way and they edify each other, it creates what's called the Benjamin Franklin effect. Meaning, if I do a favor for Dwayne, if I'm doing you a favor, I actually neurologically like you, because it
Mhm.
would be cognitive dissonance for me to do a favor for somebody I don't like. So I automatically will start to like you just by doing something for you.
Yeah, you're as you're walking through this, I don't know if you can see me smiling, but there's a lot of I feel good about what you're saying because I've delivered this training for like the past 3 years. I don't know if we've ever talked about it, but um it's called How to Sell Freedom Without Starting a Fight. Have you ever heard me talk about this training?
I think you may have vaguely, I remember vaguely you touching on it, but go ahead and give it because it sounds fascinating.
So I've given this all started when I was at a conference and somebody said, "Can you train?" And I was like, "Yeah." And then I thought, "What are we going to train tomorrow?" And I thought, "What does this group need?" And it stemmed from one group that I was at to recognizing there was this need across the country. I don't know if you've noticed it or not, Sardek, but there's a bit of tension in the country these days.
Wow,
And
surprise.
yeah, I know. And one of the things that I've tried to do is teach people how to talk without starting a fight. And
Hmm.
a lot of it comes back to something Stephen Covey taught me back in the 90s, where you've got to seek first to understand
Yes.
and then to be understood. And I said the premise of this training is we get in political arguments because we're only listening deeply enough to tell the other person why they're an idiot.
Right.
And so the whole part, as I do these, I've been baffled at the fact that these will invariably turn into family therapy. And I
Hmm.
don't say that lightly. I mean, I had a room of 75 people in Denver, Colorado. And this guy stands up at the end of this and says, "What do you do when they just won't listen to you, Dwayne? What do you do when you give them the facts and you give them the figures and you tell them the stories and they just won't listen to you?" And he's
Hmm.
agitated. And I said, "Friend, we've just spent an hour saying that you should be listening to them." And he dropped his eyes to the floor. When he brought him back up, I could tell he's about to cry. And every time I tell this story, I about cry. And he says, "I haven't talked to my son in 2 years." That was powerful. But in Maine later that year, at a room of 100 people, and this guy stands up and says, "What do you do when they just look at you and say, 'I hate you'?" And I said, "You look them square in the eye and you say, 'Tell me more.' And I hope to God you're not talking about family." And he couldn't talk. He just nodded and sat down. And I sat back and I thought, what is it that's going on in these trainings that's allowing these people the opportunity to bear open something so personal to them? And the whole first part of this training is not me teaching them anything. The first thing I do is, here's a worksheet. I want you to write down the principles that you think are foundational to a free society. Then they work on that by themselves. And then I say, I want you to get in a small group and I want you to explain to everybody what you wrote down and why it's important to you. And then if somebody writes down something that you like, you can put it on your list. And so then they work as a small group for probably 10 minutes. And then I say, okay, everyone pick a leader. You know how Bob used to do that, pick a
Yep.
leader.
Yep.
And then I'd say, okay, Sardek, what did your group talk about? And then you start talking and you'll say something and I'll say, tell me more about that. And you'll say, well, that wasn't even mine. That was actually Bob's over here. And then Bob will start talking. And so we get a little bit more. And what I finally came to realize, and as you're talking, I'm like, this is what happens. I was creating little pockets of safety that just kind of ballooned outward. First, you're safe on your own. Then you're safe in
Hmm.
your little small group. And then you're safe speaking out a little bit because this is something you believe in. I'm not asking you a question like, Sardek, tell me what the founders thought about the rule of law. You're like, well,
Right.
I don't know. I know what I think about it.
Hmm.
And so what you're saying is there's neuroscience that shows that each one of those little steps that I was taking is actually giving them the opportunity so that an hour and a half into this, they can say, I haven't talked to my son in 2 years.
Hmm. That's exactly what I'm saying. And the fact that you're able to cite a real world example also reaffirms why you, and I say this with all sincerity and genuineness, that's why you're as good as you are, Dwayne. Because, and again, Bob, I don't know if he was trained on this or he intuitively knew it. My guess, and I have a real kind of gut feeling that he just got it. Some people get this
Yeah.
intuitively about human beings. And you do that and that's why it works. So what the corporate world is calling right now, that buzzword of psychological safety, you're right. The way you just described it, first individual, then, and expands out like the concentric circles of a tree. The other way it's taught in sales is the ladder effect. So salespeople are taught to get yeses. And this is where Dale Carnegie had the yes factor in his How to Win Friends and Influence People, get people to say yes 3 times. And now you're reducing resistance. So psychologically, that's another technique. So this stuff, this is, like I said, most trainers don't know this. And just imagine how this could affect the design of training. If they would do what you do, create the space for trust to be built first, then the rest of it is easy. People, you'll have to shut them up.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's what you want. I was talking with Lynn Milbauer earlier, and we were talking about the fact that so often, and so many trainers I've seen not get this, they walk into the room like they are God's gift to the world, and the
Hmm.
people in that room are blessed to even have them there.
Yeah.
And Len and I were talking about the fact that so often the what you're teaching people in the room already know. You just need to find a way to pull it out of them, and you can't do that if they don't feel safe or if they think that you're just there to impress them.
Right. That I call that the creating monologues with hostages syndrome.
Yeah, I've heard you
Right.
say that. That's great.
Yeah. Right. And it's really driven out of our ego. A trainer walks in, and I recently had a trainer in one of my programs say he was confused. He's like, wait a minute, I was always taught that I needed to be like the guide and I need to be the know-it-all and in another training. And now you're telling me something completely different. And so I asked him, I said, so why are you taking another training if you were already taught something? He said, because I'm not getting the results I want. I said, well, and that's why you're not getting them, because you are the sage on the stage as opposed to being the guide. And training versus facilitation, this is the difference. And it was like at that moment, the skies parted, the sun shone, and his brain opened up, and he was released of the burden of having to know it all.
Yeah, yeah, because you can't. You
You
can't.
can't.
I don't know how many the look of relief on some of my colleagues' faces when they say, "Well, what do you do?" And they just ask a question you don't have the answer. I say, "What I do is I go, that's interesting. What do y'all think?"
Right.
It's that simple. I don't know. What do y'all think?
Yeah, crowdsourcing is amazing. That's why it's so powerful in social media,
Yeah.
you know.
So after Connect, what did you say was next?
So after the connection is the piece around interaction, which is the experiential learning. Now, this is where it gets another technique that you can use here that we tend to have used, and Bob was a master at this. And you may have heard this. Some of us who have studied, we may have heard about this. And it's called the peak in theory or principle. I don't know if you've ever heard that before. Peak in
Mm.
principle or peak in theory. So
Tell me more.
Daniel Kahneman found this in his research. And what he found was people will judge their experience around something based on two main things: the intense moment of that experience, the most intense moment, and the very end of that experience. So that's what leads to what's called emotional contrast. So we take people through an experience where they have an intense experience, and that can be creating an emotion around joy, excitement, fear, any of these experiences, right? So you get to that level of intensity, and they will judge their entire experience off of that single part where it's intense, and then what happens at the very end. So when you think about experiential activities, one of the methods that I teach is agitate a problem that people have, that is a known problem that your audience has, put them into an experiential that creates or simulates that problem or the emotions tied to that problem. Because what will happen is as they get into it, the intensity, they'll remember that moment, and then you give them the solution at the end. And that's why I always come back and give the solution at the end. So, for example, a lot of people will know me for what I call a taste of change, using the candies, the warheads. And I teach change in 10 minutes with that piece of candy. And what people tend to remember about that candy, they don't remember anything about the model around change management. What they remember is how bad the intense moment, how bad it tastes when you first started. And that's what change feels like. It invokes fear, resistance, anger, all those emotions. And then they remember, wow, it got sweet at the end. So it sucked at the very beginning and it got really good at the end. And that's the metaphor for change. All of my experientials, when I put them into play, they use the peak in theory. And I had no idea that was what I was doing until I saw the research. And I was like, no wonder this works so well.
And then you got those weirdos who just love things that are sour and they're happy from the get go, just like you have weirdos who love change. We're changing again. And you're like,
Yep.
it's not good. No, and I
Right.
love this stuff. One of the experientials that you did that stuck with me was where you had all the numbers on the floor
Hmm.
and then people had to change positions on that. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, that's commonly known as several names, but most commonly known as keypad. So for those of your audience who may not necessarily be aware of it, you take 30 numbers and place them on the floor, and you put them inside of a bordered, whether it's a rectangle or even an odd shape. The shape of the box or whatever you put these numbers in doesn't matter. In fact, that's a debriefable point. But the point here is the idea is you give this team of participants the goal and the responsibility for completing a task without violating five rules. So if you can imagine, there's 30 dots on the floor and the rules go like this. You all have to complete this task and as fast as possible with no violations of the following rules. Only one person in the work area at any given time. Each person must touch at least one dot. When you're in the work area, you cannot touch more than one dot. No one person can touch two consecutive numbers. So I can't touch 4 and be the person that touches 5. And then the numbers cannot be rearranged. That's the system, the static system it is. And what happens, it takes about an hour with multiple practices before they get it right. And they need to do it within 45 to 60 seconds with no violations. It takes them up to an hour to get it done. And what that activity reveals is people think they're good at collaborating until they face a problem. And what starts to happen is people naturally go lone wolf. They do not collaborate naturally. You get into fights, arguments, disagreements on how to do the process, and they execute without planning. It is a great activity. It creates a lot of frustration. And that's where I use that to say, okay, once they get the rhythm down of asking the right type of questions, they get it down to 45 to 60 seconds with no violations. But it is a painful experience for most people.
It is. It is. I remember, and there's apathy in there too, because one of the things that hit me was the folks who were where the action was going on. You were right.
Mhm.
They're doing their own thing. They knew what needed to be done. We just need to get it done. But I'm out on the end going, I don't know what's going on. They don't talk
Right.
to us out here in the field. At headquarters, they have all their goals, but out here in the field, I don't even
Mhm.
know if we exist. And I thought, what a powerful, you do that at like an executives retreat. That experience will be eye-opening. And one of the things that Bob talked about, um, is people don't argue with their own data.
Right.
And Sardek, you could say, hey, you all don't talk to the field enough. And they can be like, this guy didn't know us. But when they experience it, then
Mhm.
why is that so important that they experience it and they come to those conclusions?
Well, here's an interesting point around neuroscience. What's very intriguing about people and their mindset is they see a problem or a challenge. They project that problem or challenge onto the person as opposed to separating it as an issue. And oftentimes, and I have this definition of conflict. Conflict is nothing more than unspoken and unmet needs and expectations. So I expect you to do something. I don't tell you what my expectation are. You clearly don't meet it. And then I get frustrated with you about you as opposed to the problem itself. So what we don't do is we don't separate in conflict. We don't separate the issue from the person. We see the person and the issue as one and the same. And that serves as a very severe mental barrier. And that's one of the things that these activities, when used right, you can remind people, let them see it in action, and then remind them what was getting in the way. Why did you see Dwayne as, Dwayne is a high D in the disc model. He's ready to go make it happen. You're over here as a high C. You want to plan it out. He's not giving you what you need, but you're not saying anything. You're sitting back watching, getting more and more frustrated with him. He's looking at you like, why aren't, you're not doing anything. So chop, chop, let's go. No communication around expectations. And now we're focused on the person as opposed to, meanwhile, the plane is going down. This is why airline pilots have simulators and they go through. And if you ever listen to, and I'm a weirdo like this, as much as I fly, I probably shouldn't, but I do. I listen to and watch air disasters and all that, why planes crash. And one of the phenomenal things about airline pilot simulations, you rarely ever hear a pilot screaming because what they're taught over and over and over in those simulations is during a problem, you collaborate, you look for a solution, and because if you don't, you die potentially.
Yeah.
And
Like
so that's that. Yeah, they get the ego out of the way.
Yeah, like in Sully. I don't know. I think I forget the name of the movie, but there's a book called The Checklist Manifesto, and they talk about. Have you read that?
I haven't read it, but I'm familiar with the process. Yeah.
It's a great book, but they talked about the fact that pilots have these checklists even in the middle of disasters. They're like, get the
Yeah.
checklist, and
Yeah.
they go through it. Boom, boom, boom. One guy's flying, the other, she might be going through the checklist, but they're together because they want to get out of this alive.
Hmm.
And that's fantastic. Let me ask you this: as you've done this research in neuroscience, how has that changed the way that you deliver?
It's a fantastic question. So, what it's doing for me is reaffirming a lot of the things that I've kind of stumbled along and across through either my own experience or learning from others, clearly learning from Bob and others, and just watching. For all intents and purposes, I'm a behavioral kind of nut job. I like to watch people in action and try to understand the patterns of behavior because my brain sees patterns. And what that has done for me is the research. Now I'm getting even more excited. I'm like, oh, now if I can teach the neuroscience behind it, I can isolate the specific behaviors to create habits around. So what this is doing for me is it's not necessarily changing a lot of the way I facilitate, but it's changing where I put emphasis on in how I teach others how to facilitate because they get caught up in a lot of things that really create no value and are as useless as a G in lasagna. So if we figure out what to do specifically and repeat those behaviors, it's kind of like driving a car. I don't need to teach you everything about driving a car. If I teach you the basic habits, you can operate on your own and do it safely. So that's where I'm going with this. And this is not tied to just training. The next book, so the research I've been doing was for a new book. And that book is also going to be focused on leaders because the same concepts and principles that we do as facilitators are the same concepts and principles that high performing leaders model and demonstrate as well.
Mhm. That sounds great. That sounds great. So what I'm curious about is as you look through this stuff, do you see this busting any of like Malcolm Knowles' ideas of adult learning theory, or is this just reaffirming or giving some credibility to what he had laid out before?
I think it's an and. So I don't know that it'll bust and I don't know that it will reaffirm some things, but I do think, and I won't say but, and I think there will be opportunities for, like everything else, as we learn more about things over time, we find refinements. So I do believe that and I am starting to go on public record for saying we are using outdated instructional design principles because of all the knowledge around the way the brain works and how things are morphing. And quite frankly, the pandemic forced a lot of rewiring of the brain and habits. So the generation after Z, that younger generation, they are going to be wholly different from any other generation in the way they think and operate and the way their brains work than any other generation in history. And we are woefully unprepared for that group that's coming in. So I do, to answer your question, yeah, I think there's some change and refinement that will come to adult principles or principles of adult learning.
I'm just I'm laughing because I'm imagining doing like an orientation training with a group of the next generation, and they're just all out there going 6, 7. And you're like, what? What are you
Yeah,
talking about? This has nothing to
right,
do with this.
right.
And yeah, but I will not be training my kids. And they 6, 7, get out, get out of
Right.
there.
I was
So,
talking to a friend of mine and she's Lebanese and she's working on some training and she had in her concepts Gagne's 9 events of instruction
mhm.
and she was going to use that. And I said, yeah, you drop 9 events of instruction to a group of people and watch their eyes glaze over. What they need to know is really there's 3 out of those that really matter in today's modern way of facilitating. So don't go over all 9 because that's just a waste of time, quite frankly. Focus on the things that really matter. And I gave her my insights on, from a neuroscience perspective, which of those 9 really matter. And I mean, if you want to put in and let them read about it, that's great. But in spending your live instruction time, focus on 3 of those parts of events, instruction or whatever.
Sounds fascinating. This is I'm just looking at the schedule. You're going to be training on Monday, February. It's in the book. Hopefully, y'all are getting this book.
Hmm.
2:30 in the afternoon on Monday, February 23rd. I don't know that I'll be there, but if I get a chance to go, I will definitely sit in because this has been a fascinating conversation, and I can't wait to see um, I think we've got kind of the skeleton in this half an hour conversation. I want to see the muscle system, and I want to see the circulatory. So how does this whole thing work? And I think there's a lot more out there that we need to learn from someone like you. So thank you for taking the time to talk to me about this. This sounds great.
It's my pleasure, Dwayne, as always, man. And, I'm doing this session here. And although we haven't gotten confirmation yet from ATD and the international conference, I submitted something very similar for that conference. So more than likely that'll be at that conference in May in Los Angeles in 2026. So stay tuned. And there's so much. And again, I'm releasing a lot of some of this stuff already in my Ask a Master Facilitator video blog series, the Zygarnik effect, and so this one in terms of escalating mutual, vulnerability and things like that. So feel free to, if you want a preview of all this, catch it there.
I'll link to it in the blog or in the show notes for this, so everyone can go take a look at it. Thanks again. I know we had to struggle to get this done, but persistence pays, and this was a good conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, well, we pivot, and that's what great people do, and I appreciate your ability to pivot. We made it happen, however it gets done, and hopefully this adds some significant intrigue and value to your audience, as I'm sure it will.
Thanks again, man.
All right, my pleasure, brother.